The smell of sawdust never really leaves a place like that. Even after 40 years of weather and silence, my father's workshop in Vermont still held it thick in the walls, soaked into the floorboards, drifting through the broken window latch he always meant to fix. I stood in the doorway the morning after we buried him, and for a second, I forgot he was gone. The smell was too alive for that. My name is Ethan Calloway. I'm 32. I've been married for 4 years to a woman. I thought I understood. My father raised me alone after my mother left when I was 7, no explanation, no goodbye note, just an empty closet and a half-finished cup of coffee on the kitchen counter that he never talked about. He wasn't a man who filled silence with words. He taught me things with his hands. How to read grain in a piece of wood. How to shake someone's hand and mean it. How to spot a person who smiles too wide when they want something. I wish I'd paid better attention to that last one. The funeral was small. My father had outlived most of his friends, and the ones still standing were men like him, quiet, deliberate, slightly uncomfortable in dress shirts. My wife stood beside me at the graveside in a black coat she'd bought specifically for the occasion. I remember thinking that was odd. We'd driven up to Vermont the moment I got the call from the hospital, barely time to pack. But she had a new coat. I filed that away somewhere and didn't look at it again until much later. His attorney, a soft-spoken man named Gerald who'd handled my father's affairs for over 2 decades, pulled me aside after the reception. He pressed a plain envelope into my hand and told me not to open it until I was alone. He said my father had been very specific about that. I nodded and tucked it into the inside pocket of my jacket against my chest and didn't think too much about it. My father was a private man. Of course, he'd have instructions about how things were done. My wife and her brother had driven up separately. He'd offered to come for moral support, which I thought was considerate at the time. They stayed at the same inn we did, 2 rooms down the hall. That evening, after dinner, I told my wife I needed some air and walked down to the river that ran behind the property. The cold hit hard. Vermont in November has a particular kind of cold that doesn't negotiate. I stood there maybe 20 minutes before I walked back. The hallway of the inn was quiet. My wife's brother's door was slightly open, the way it gets when the latch doesn't catch fully, and I heard their voices before I could decide not to listen. Said the attorney barely talked at the service. That was my wife. That means the paperwork's already done. Her brother, lower, more careful. It's probably just the house and the workshop. Old tools, maybe some savings. Nothing significant. Gerald has had his files for years, my wife said. I heard the soft creak of a chair. The workshop property alone is worth something. That land's been assessed twice in the last decade. I had a friend pull the county records. A pause. Ethan won't push back, her brother said. He never does. He'll grieve for 6 months and we just need to be patient. The joint accounts. I've already talked to Marcus about the refinancing. Her voice dropped, but I was close enough. If Ethan signs by the end of the year, we use the equity to cover what we owe Marcus and walk away clean. Ethan will think it's for the renovation we've been talking about. And if he asks questions? She laughed. It was brief and quiet, and I had heard that laugh before, but never aimed at me like that. He never asks the right questions. I didn't move. I stood in that hallway with my hand resting against the wallpaper, and I counted my own heartbeats until I had control of my breathing again. Then I turned around, walked back outside, and sat on the back steps of the inn until the cold made my fingers numb. That was when I opened the envelope. My father's handwriting was precise and angular, the handwriting of a man who measured twice before committing anything to paper. Ethan, if Gerald gave you this, then I'm gone and you're sitting somewhere trying to hold yourself together. So I'll be brief. In the false bottom of the red toolbox, the one you always thought was just ballast, there's a key. Brass. Old hardware store tag still on it. That key opens a lockbox at Merchants Trust in Burlington, branch on College Street. Go alone. What's inside belongs to you. I've been waiting for the right time to tell you in person. I'm sorry, the right time never came. I love you, son. Don't let them rush you into anything. Don't let them rush you into anything. I read that line 3 times. He knew. I didn't understand yet how much he knew, or what he had prepared, but in that moment I understood that my father had been watching with those same quiet eyes he used when he was deciding whether a piece of wood was worth saving or had too much rot inside. I didn't go back to the room that night. I told my wife I was staying at the workshop. There were things to sort through, I said, and I'd be back in the morning. She offered to come with me. I said I needed the solitude. She accepted that easily, which told me something. The red toolbox was exactly where it always was, 3rd shelf from the bottom on the left wall. I had lifted that box 100 times as a kid, hauling it to whatever project my father was working on. It was heavy then. It was lighter now. I pried up the false bottom, a clean piece of plywood fitted flush, something he'd built himself. Invisible unless you knew to look, and found the key exactly where he said it would be. I slept in the workshop that night on an old cot he kept for late nights. The smell of sawdust kept me company. Burlington is 45 minutes from the property. I was at Merchants Trust when they opened at 8:30. The branch manager, a woman named Donna who'd clearly known my father for years, walked me back herself without a word of explanation needed. She'd been expecting me, she said. Mr. Calloway had called ahead several months ago and left instructions. The lockbox contained 4 things. The first was the deed to the workshop property and the 2 acres surrounding it, my father's name and mine, listed as joint tenants with right of survivorship. The property had transferred to me automatically at the moment of his death. No probate required. The second was a separate deed. A 12-acre parcel of forested land in Stowe, Vermont, with a small cabin on the property. Paid in full. My name only. I had never heard of it. The third was a share certificate. My father had quietly purchased a 15% stake in a regional lumber supply company called Birchline Materials 18 months earlier, a company that had since been acquired by a larger conglomerate. The stake was now worth considerably more than what he'd paid. The shares were registered in my name, not his. The fourth was a letter. 4 pages, handwritten, folded in thirds. I stood at the counter in Merchants Trust and read it slowly. He had met my wife's family twice before our wedding, once at the engagement dinner, once at a pre-wedding gathering at her parents' house. Both times, he told me, he watched. He described small things I had overlooked or dismissed. Her father's questions about my salary, asked casually but asked twice. Her brother's interest in whether I owned my apartment or rented. The way they spoke about money in her family, always circling it, always calculating. He wrote that he said nothing because he didn't want to cost me something I wanted. But he started building quietly after that. He moved the workshop deed into joint survivorship. He bought the Stowe parcel under my name only, using a power of attorney I had signed years earlier for a different purpose, entirely legal. He had Gerald verify it twice. He purchased the Birchline shares and had them registered directly to me. None of it appeared in his estate because none of it was his estate. It was already mine. I don't know what they're planning, he wrote, but people who calculate the way they do always have a plan. I wanted to make sure there was nothing here for them to reach. The workshop is yours. The land in Stowe is yours. The shares are yours. Gerald has copies of everything. Get a good attorney before you say a word to anyone. I mean that, son. Before you say a single word. He ended the letter with something he had never said out loud to me, not once, not in 32 years together. He wrote it plainly, in that precise angular handwriting, and I had to set the pages down on the counter for a moment before I could finish reading. Donna pretended to find something very interesting to look at on the far side of the room. I was grateful for that. I called my college roommate from the parking lot. He was an attorney. Now he'd gone into family and property law, something I'd teased him about at graduation. He answered on the second ring. I told him I needed help. I said my father had just died and I was standing in a bank parking lot in Burlington with 4 documents and a situation that was more complicated than I'd expected. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't go home yet. Send me photos of everything. And don't sign anything." I drove to the Stowe property. I needed to see it. The cabin was small and well kept. Someone had been maintaining it. A woman named Ruth, who lived on the adjacent property, came out when she heard my car on the gravel. She'd been watching the place for the past year, she said. Mr. Calloway paid her quarterly to keep an eye on it, clear the gutters in fall, check the pipes in winter. She looked at me for a moment. "You have his eyes," she said. "He talked about you when he came up to check on things." She paused. "He came up more often than you might think." I walked through the cabin alone. It was simple and clean, a wood stove, a small kitchen, 2 rooms. On the windowsill above the kitchen sink, facing the tree line, there was a framed photograph I had never seen before. My father and me at a little league game. I must have been 9 or 10. He was laughing at something I'd apparently just said, head thrown back. Completely unguarded. I don't have many photos of my father laughing like that. I stood at that window for a long time. My attorney friend called back at noon. He'd reviewed the photos I sent. Everything was clean, he said. The joint tenancy on the workshop was ironclad. The Stowe parcel was in my name alone, purchased before our marriage, which mattered enormously. The Birchline shares were premarital assets registered directly to me. In Vermont, inherited property and premarital assets are not subject to equitable distribution in a divorce. Divorce? I said. A pause. Ethan, what did you hear? I told him. The hallway. The refinancing. Marcus, whoever that was. The joint accounts. He was quiet for a moment. The joint accounts are the exposure, he said. How much is in them? Not a significant amount. My father had always told me not to let money sit in places you share with people you haven't tested. I'd followed his advice without fully understanding why. Then you're in a better position than you probably feel right now, my attorney friend said. Here's what you're going to do. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, I had done 3 things. I had sent a certified digital notice to our joint bank, flagging the accounts for legal review and requesting a hold on any outgoing transfers pending documentation. Our bank had a process for this. My attorney friend walked me through it word by word. I had forwarded a package to Gerald, the full contents of the lockbox, a summary of what I'd overheard, and a request to formally document the asset structure before any family discussion took place. And I had called a divorce attorney in Burlington, a woman named Patricia, who had been handling these cases for 20 years and who, when I finished explaining the situation, said simply, "You called at the right time." My phone started showing missed calls around 4. My wife first, 3 in a row. Then her brother. Then a number I didn't recognize, which I later confirmed was Marcus, a business associate of her family who had apparently been part of the plan before I was. I let all of them ring. Her father called at 5:15. I answered that one. Ethan. His voice was warm, the way it always was when he wanted something. "We've been trying to reach you. Your wife is worried sick. Whatever happened to your father's estate, we can sit down and handle this as a family. No need for banks getting involved." "I appreciate that," I said. I was sitting on the porch of the Stowe cabin watching the sun drop behind the tree line. "But I've got attorneys handling the estate now, so all of that needs to go through them." A beat. The warmth cooled slightly. "Attorneys aren't necessary for a family matter." "It's not really a family matter," I said. "It's a legal one." He tried for another few minutes. The warmth came and went in waves, appearing whenever he sensed resistance, receding when he thought he was making progress. I recognized the pattern. I had just never seen it clearly before. When I ended the call, I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, exactly. More like clarity. The kind that comes when you finally stop explaining yourself to someone who was never listening. My wife drove up to Vermont 2 days later. She'd gotten the address of the Stowe cabin from the county property record. She mentioned this herself, unprompted, apparently not realizing that telling me she'd pulled property records was its own kind of admission. She knocked on the door of the cabin in a coat that matched the one from the funeral, and when I opened the door, her face was arranged in the expression I had once mistaken for vulnerability. "I've been scared," she said. "You just disappeared. I didn't know if you were okay." I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. The air was cold and clean, the kind of cold that makes everything sharp. "I'm okay," I said. "The bank called. There's a hold on our accounts." "Ethan, what did you do?" The vulnerability in her expression sharpened at the edges. "Your father just died. This isn't the time to blow things up." "I didn't blow anything up," I said. "I just stopped moving fast." She looked at me carefully. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not signing the refinancing. I'm not signing anything right now." I looked at her. "You bought a new coat for the funeral." She blinked. "What?" "We got the call at 11 at night and drove straight up." "But you had a new coat. You'd already planned to be here." The silence that followed was different from the silences I was used to from her. The ones she used to make me fill with reassurance. This one was calculating. "You're not being rational," she said finally. "You're grieving and you're making decisions you're going to regret." "Maybe." I reached into my jacket and handed her a document. Patricia had prepared it. A formal petition for dissolution of marriage, filed that morning in Burlington County. She stared at it. "The property here isn't marital," I said. "The workshop property transferred to me before your family had time to pull records. The Birchline shares are premarital. Gerald has documentation for all of it. Patricia, my attorney, has copies of everything." I paused. "You're going to want to get your own attorney? A good one. Not Marcus." "This is insane," she said. But her voice had lost its footing. "We've been married 4 years." "I know," I said. "I was there for all of them. You're doing this because you heard one conversation. You don't know what was going on. You don't know the context. I know your brother said I never asked the right questions." I said it quietly. "I know your father said you'd been babysitting my broke ass. I know you'd already contacted Marcus before we even left for Vermont." I looked at her. "That's not one conversation. That's a plan." She opened her mouth and closed it again. "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it. I had expected to feel angrier than this. What I felt instead was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I think your family taught you that this is how you navigate the world, and I think it worked for a long time. It almost worked here." I paused. "But my father saw it before I did." He spent the last 2 years quietly making sure there was nothing here for it to work on. She looked out at the tree line, then back at me. The calculation in her expression softened briefly into something that might have been genuine. I couldn't tell anymore, and I'd stopped trying to parse the difference. Is there anything I can say to change this? I thought about my father's handwriting on that last line of his letter. What he had taken 32 years to write down. I thought about the photograph on the kitchen windowsill, him laughing at a little league game. No, I said. But I hope you find something real eventually. I mean that. She stood there another moment, then walked back to her car. I went inside and made coffee on the small stove and sat at the kitchen table while the light went blue outside the windows. My attorney friend called to check in. Patricia had already received an inquiry from her brother's attorney fast, I said. He told me that was normal, it just meant we'd filed first and that mattered. Gerald called shortly after to confirm he'd received the formal notice of divorce proceedings and would be prepared to provide documentation as needed. The logistics of it were almost calm in their steadiness, one piece, then the next. What was harder was the evening itself. The quiet of the cabin. The particular stillness that comes when a version of your life stops and you haven't yet seen the shape of what comes next. I called Ruth next door and asked if she'd be willing to sit on the porch for a while. She came over with a thermos of tea, and we sat in the cold, and she told me about the times my father had come up to check on the property. He'd help her clear branches after storms. He'd fixed her back fence one September without being asked. She said, he talked about me the way people talk about things they're proud of but don't quite know how to say directly. He was very proud of you, she said. He just didn't always have the language for it. I told her I knew. I think I'd always known, even when it would have helped to hear it plainly. Over the following weeks, the legal process moved the way legal processes do, not quickly but steadily. Her father made 2 attempts to negotiate directly, bypassing the attorneys, both of which Patricia handled by return email with a politeness that contained no flexibility. Her brother stopped calling after the second week. Marcus sent a single formal letter that went nowhere because there was nothing in the marital estate for him to reach. The joint accounts were closed and divided according to contribution records. The division was straightforward because I had always kept clean documentation, another thing my father had insisted on without explaining why. The workshop property and the Stowe cabin remained exactly where they were. The Birchline shares I transferred into a modest investment account. I didn't touch them right away. I didn't need to. What I did do in the 3rd week of December was drive back to the workshop in Vermont with a notepad and spend 2 days taking careful inventory of everything inside. The tools, the equipment, the lumber supply, the condition of the structure itself. I had grown up in that space. I knew every shelf, every drawer, every particular creak in the floor near the back door. My father had done most of his work alone, but there was one young man, Kyle, 24, who'd been apprenticing with him for nearly a year before he died. He showed up while I was still taking inventory, not sure if he still had a reason to come in. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he reminded me so specifically of myself at that age that I had to look away for a second. I asked him what he'd been working on with my father. He showed me 3 ongoing commissions, a custom bookcase, a dining table, a restoration project for a church in Montpelier. My father had taught him everything about each piece. The work was careful and precise, exactly the way my father would have wanted it done. I told him the workshop was staying open. I told him he had a job for as long as he wanted it, and that we'd figure out the commissions together, and that if he wanted to learn the business side of it, I'd teach him what I was learning myself. He nodded several times without saying much, which was exactly the right response as far as I was concerned. Some things that were built well deserved to keep standing. I moved into the Stowe cabin for the winter. It was smaller than anything I'd lived in since college, and the wood stove required attention in a way that electric heat doesn't, and the nearest grocery store was 20 minutes down a mountain road that got complicated in bad weather. I didn't mind any of it. The simplicity of those early weeks was something I hadn't known. I needed waking up to the sound of wind in the trees, spending evenings reading by the stove, having no one's expectations to manage but my own. I talked to my father in those evenings, the way people do when they've lost someone and the words they didn't say while the person was alive start needing somewhere to go. I talked to him about what I was doing with the workshop, and about Kyle, and about the way things had unfolded after he died. I told him he'd built something that held. I told him I understood, finally, what all the quiet preparation had been about. I told him I was sorry it had taken something like this for me to see clearly. The divorce was finalized in early spring. Patricia handled it without drama. The division was clean because the assets were clearly documented and her attorneys had nothing structural to challenge. She got what was equitably hers from the marital period. Nothing more. Her father's name came up twice in depositions related to the financial maneuvering with Marcus, and while that wasn't my concern directly, Gerald had forwarded the relevant documentation to the appropriate parties without fanfare. Some wheels turn slowly, but they do turn. On the last day of the legal proceedings, her attorney sent a brief email saying my former wife wished me well. I read it in Patricia's office. I thought about the hallway in the inn, and the new coat at the funeral, and the laughter I'd heard through a door that wasn't quite latched. I wished her well too. I wrote it back because I meant it. The anger I'd expected to feel had mostly dissolved into something closer to sadness, not for what I'd lost, but for what had apparently never been there to lose. I drove back up to Vermont that evening. The workshop smelled like sawdust and fresh-cut pine. Kyle had finished the bookcase and started the dining table, and he'd made a small modification to the joinery on one section that was, honestly, better than what my father's original plan had called for. I stood there looking at it for a minute and then told him so. He looked surprised, and then pleased. And then immediately focused on the next problem to solve, which was exactly the right instinct. I picked up a piece of walnut from the supply rack and turned it over in my hands. There's a way of reading grain that my father tried to teach me for years before it finally made sense. You're not looking at the surface. You're looking at the structure beneath it. What holds, and what doesn't. What's worth the work, and what will crack under pressure no matter what you do with it. I set the walnut back and walked to the window. Outside, the light was doing that thing it does in Vermont in early spring, low and gold and specific in a way that makes everything look considered. My phone was in my pocket. I didn't take it out. There was nothing I needed to answer. No one I needed to manage, nothing to protect against. Just the grain of the wood and the smell of the workshop and the particular quiet of a place that had been built by someone who understood that the most important things don't announce themselves. He had spent 2 years building something I couldn't see and didn't know to look for. He'd done it without asking for credit, without explaining himself, without any guarantee I'd ever understand what he'd done or why. I stood at the window for a long time. Then I picked up my tools. There was work to do. The real kind, the kind that takes patience and precision and the willingness to start over if the first attempt isn't right. The kind that doesn't produce anything overnight but produces something that lasts. My father understood that better than anyone I've ever known. I was starting to